Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolano. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Roberto Bolano is typically viewed as one of the best Spanish language authors of his generation. He is known for writing relatively maximalist fiction, which is a term I see get thrown a lot when talking about his stuff, specifically towards 2666, which is one of his later novels. He passed away in 2003. Before that, this book, The Savage Detectives, came out in 1998, was translated into English in 2007, and is about, is split into three parts, and is about, the first part concerns a young poet named Juan Garcia Madero, who integrates himself with this group of young Mexican poets called it's kind of a scene of poetry, and the scene is built around these two main kind of the towering figures of the movement, who are the founders of the movement, or co-founders of the movement, Arturo Bolano, and I believe Ulysses Lima, I believe, is the other individual. And Juan Garcia kind of becomes a part of this movement, which is a scene of about, 20 people or so. And that's kind of the first section, is him as, I think, a 17-year-old deciding to leave law school and becoming involved in this scene as a poet and writing poetry and hanging out with poets, and meeting up with a family called the Font family, who are an architect. The kind of patriarch of the family is an architect who's kind of slowly going crazy. His wife and his two daughters, who are also poets, who are relatively well-acclaimed poets who had won awards. And Juan Garcia Madero gets involved in them, and through them he gets into kind of a misadventure, which we kind of flash back to in the third part of the book. But that's essentially the first part of the book. It takes place in over 2 months in 1975. The end of 1975, I think it begins in like November, so it's November and December of 1975. And then the middle section of the book, which is about 70% of the book, so the majority of the book, is essentially a travelogue of these two founders of the movement, Bolano, and I think it's Lisa. I can't quite remember the second poet's name, but the two of them, for roughly 20, it's really the 25 years of their comings and goings as they travel everywhere, including Mexico, the United States, Europe, and Africa. They just kind of travel all over for 25 years, or about 20 years. And the middle section is told as kind of an oral history of them, of their time in all these places as they're traveling throughout. And then the third section goes back to 1976, so right after the end of the first section, where Juan Garcia Madero and these two individuals, along with one of the friends of Juan Garcia Madero's, one of his girlfriends, is along with them, and they're being chased by her boyfriend/pimp, and they are kind of on a quest to find this kind of mythical person who was a poet back in the 20s and kind of inspired them to begin the movement, the visceral realist movement, which is kind of a play on her visceral realist that took place in, I think, the 30s and 40s. And so they're kind of reliving that or honoring her, and so they go to kind of meet her. So there's a lot going on in this book. So that's kind of the plot. I really enjoyed the first part of the book that takes about 100 pages of Juan Garcia Madero and him kind of joining this scene of poets. I thought that was really fun. I think, like, anytime you're writing about a scene, you kind of get the different relationships of people and what they're doing and the rivalries and who's dating who and kind of all that stuff. I think that's done really well, and that part's really interesting. I really enjoy the cover, the Picador cover. I think is really cool. Mine's pretty beat up by this point. But I enjoyed that. I think that Roberto Bolano is actually a really talented author, sentence to sentence. I think you kind of always know what's going on, and he covers a lot of ground and does a lot of stuff. But this book, for me, was probably the hardest book to read for this channel, just because I didn't really feel it had any kind of propulsion to it at all. The middle section especially, once you get past the first section, which I think does have some propulsion, is I think for me far and away the best section of the book. Well, is the best section of the book. The third section I think is pretty good too, but once you get past the first section, you get into this almost oral history of these two men as they're kind of crisscrossing. And in my mind, the oral histories, because there's so many of them, there's not a propulsion to what's happening. I didn't care so much about these characters. And it was very, very difficult to kind of keep reading. And they're described physically as looking very similar. And in my mind, they're almost the same person. And so it was just kind of feeling like you have all these kind of interstitial chapters that almost served as like short stories of their own. It reminded me a lot of Hotel Honolulu by Paul Theroux, which I reviewed for the channel. I'll put a link to that below. But it also reminded me of a book by Christopher Priest called The Islands, which is kind of these kind of short stories, and some of them add to kind of an overarching plot, and some of them don't. And it felt the same way here, and I felt like there's just too much. I mean, it's like 70% of almost 600 books, so it's almost 400 pages of those stories. And they just, to me, when I hit that section, I was just at a crawl, you know. And 1Q84 is another book that I felt was a slog, and it's a very, very long book. 1Q84 felt long and was like over 1,000 pages. This book is almost 600 pages, but it felt about 3 times that long. Just for whatever reason, for me personally, there just wasn't a propulsion. I didn't enjoy a lot of the individual stories. There's some here and there that are fun, and some of them add to that overarching plot. There's a bookseller who kind of keeps coming back up in the book to remind you of, or kind of set up this idea of the quest that we see in the third section. But considering how long that section was, it just felt like a grind to me. And I just didn't feel like the stories were entertaining. I felt if there had been a mystery or some kind of part of it that was entertaining, then I think I would have done a lot better with it. But it's basically just an oral history of these two men being interviewed. It wasn't quite clear to me who was interviewing them or why they're being interviewed, but it would have at the beginning of each little section who the person was, where they were being interviewed, and then they would kind of talk about their relationship to either one of these two men most of the time. Sometimes there didn't seem to be any connection whatsoever, and you're just like, okay, well, why are we interviewing them? Some of them have kind of a tangential connection to the visceral realists, like I said, which is this group of like the 20 or so poets that we learned about in the beginning. I did some research in this book, and I guess there's a lot of characters in this book who are stand-ins for real people. So for me, I would recommend this book to anybody who knows a lot about poetry, or Mexican poetry specifically, because a lot of these people are stand-ins for real people. Having no knowledge whatsoever of that world, all that stuff kind of went over my head. And on their own, the stories personally for me I didn't find them entertaining. There's a story where 400 pages into the book, there's a duel with swords, and the book still was not entertaining to me. It was just like, On the Road to me is kind of the comparison point of this, because it's also kind of like a travelogue of these characters going from place to place. And I think that works to some degree. That book and another book that was similar would be The Sun Also Rises, to me, also had some similarities with this. So there are parts of it that I enjoyed, but it just felt like a slog to get through. Excuse me. And On the Road's like 300 pages. So even if you hate that book, if you're reading 30 pages a day, you're done with it in 2 weeks. This book just seemed to keep going on and on and on. I couldn't get through more than like 20 pages a day. It just, for whatever reason, bounced off me. And some of that, I will say, is probably, like I said, I don't have a lot of connection to the country of Mexico and its history and the movement of its poetry and things like that. So if you're someone who enjoys those things or has deep knowledge of it, I think there's a lot in here that you may connect to more than I do. I did, because a large part of it does take place in Mexico. The third section, which kind of builds off the first section, takes place right after it. That also was a section of the book that I think was a standout. But overall, for me, it was a hard book to get into, and just kind of, like I said, there was not a lot of propulsion, because I just ended up not caring really about the characters or what happened to them. There's a point where we learn what happens to Juan Garcia Madero. It's kind of hinted what happens to him. And it just kind of, again, it was kind of shoulder shrugging. And a lot of times, the middle section kind of bounces back and forth in terms of time. So one section will be from 1990, another section will be from 1976, and so kind of trying to keep all that together in your mind, it made it difficult. So I personally had a really difficult time with it. So that's the Savage Detectives. If you're someone who, like I said, has a lot of knowledge of Mexican poetry or figures of Spanish literature, then you in this from the 70s to now, then you may enjoy this a lot more than I did. But for me, it was just really kind of a slog to get through. I didn't enjoy it. And I think that's it for this time. I'm going to be reviewing The Road to Wellevue by T.C. Boyle next time. Somehow came across a signed copy, not knowing it was signed, but I do have now a signed copy of The Road to Welleville, which is pretty cool. And I'll try to get some other books in here relatively soon. I know this video took me a long time to get to. Again, I blame the Savage Detectives on that. But Lucy Foley, The Guest List, and Ask Again Yes are going to be the ones after that. And then I'm finally going to get back to The Dawn of Everything. So hopefully I'll get to that relatively soon, as well as I'll probably read the DMZ, which is on my one of my apps, so hopefully get to that. But like I said, if you did read this book and enjoy it, I know this is relatively well beloved, and it may just be I'm missing some stuff. I may go back and read it. The nice thing about the edition is there's an essay in the back. I may somehow get to that at some point, but I was pretty cold on this book. I just felt like it was a lot to get to, and there wasn't really a propulsion. I didn't find myself caring about any of these characters. If you feel differently and can recommend it, I would like to hear what anyone has to say on it. So that is The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolano. Until next time, bye.